Thank you to the Hillsborough Library, Orange County Library. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for arranging all of it. Thank you for all of the programs that you have done and you continue to do, especially during this pandemic. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much to all of you for coming. Writing a novel is the one thing I ever knew with absolute certainty I wanted to do. So to have you here is profoundly humbling, and I do thank you. Three things I should perhaps mention before I read. During the readings, when I was reading back in the days when we did this in person, I would kind of turn my head to indicate a different speaker. And I've never actually adjusted very well to the size of a screen. So if it looks like I'm ducking from aliens invading me from outer space, it's just that I haven't adjusted, but I will try and remember and tone it down. Another thing I should probably do, although I do think you've all read the book and owned 6 or 7 copies of it, I want to show you the book because I think my publisher and designer did such a nice job. I think it's a really good looking book. No matter what it is on the inside, the outside is very nice. And finally, a disclaimer. Fall is coming, it's getting a little cooler, the leaves are turning, and my allergies are here. So I have both water, and if that doesn't work, Powerade, and I may need to stop and take a little sip of that from time to time. What I thought I'd do today is read some excerpts from several short passages, and then open up for my favorite part, which is the discussions and the Q&A. I'd like to start with excerpts from the first 2 pages. Some of you have heard these before, but I thought it was a good place to start at the beginning. Most of the book is set in the Foothills retirement community, which is based on the retirement community my mother lived in the last 8 years of her life in Tucson. Geographically, and maybe even in terms of the bylaws, the Foothills is pretty much like the retirement community where my mom lived. In the center was the main building with the dining room, the library, the offices, the recreation room, and the apartments. And then out from that would be a public area with shuffleboard courts and a swimming pool and a little drive. And then further out from that were the condominiums. And then that was enclosed by a trail. And then that was surrounded by the desert, which was surrounded by the mountains. So it was concentric circles. One of the residents in the book, his name is Harry, and he likens it to Pythagoras's theory of the harmony of the spheres, where, as you know, the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the stars and the sun are each on a different circle going out sphere. Around the Earth, and they rotate around the Earth, and when they do, they each produce a tone, and the whole thing vibrates in perfect harmony. In literature, human beings are forever upsetting that harmony by their impulsive acts, and my main character, Maxine, is rather impulsive. Maxine likes Harry's theory about Pythagoras's she likes Harry's theory that the Foothills is built on Pythagoras's theory about the circles because it separates them, it links them to something more than death and taxes. I like it for the same reason, and because I liked the geography and the imagery of it. I like the concentric circles and the interlinking. So most of the novel is set in this retirement community, although the community, the building is based on a real one. The characters are fictional and the story is fictional. The first time I did a reading, I didn't make that clear. And several people thought it was a story that I'd written about my mother, and they were quite offended that I had dumped her at this retirement community and left her there by herself. I had some very interesting and odd questions as a result. So I want you to know all the rest of it's made up. The story opens in the middle of the night with 82-year-old Maxine Olson unable to sleep. She smacked Tom's side of the bed with her pillow. It had been 10 years and Maxine was still angry. They'd been married half a century. Then one night he died in his sleep. Not just any night, but this very night 10 years ago. His heart simply stopped. No warning, no suffering, at least not for him. It was precisely the way everyone here at the Foothills Retirement Community wanted to go. It was the way she wanted to go. But she was still furious with him for going and not telling her. She threw off her blankets and swung her feet over the edge of the bed. No point in lying on her half of the double bed. Far better to watch the sun rise over the mountains than to watch that blasted clock. Even without her glasses, she could read the extra large numbers. 4 a.m. She rocked to a standing position. Her knees cracked with arthritis, but they held. She waited a moment for her hips and back to realign themselves before pulling on Tom's navy blue bathrobe. Clutching a photo of Tom to her chest, she marched to her patio door, tugged it open, and stepped outside. Neither the moon nor the stars were out. Even the mountains that guarded Tucson's northeastern perimeter were barely perceptible. The darkness was broken only by the spotlight Fred Grosskopf insisted on using to illuminate his 100-year-old saguaro. But Fred's light should be stationary and more to the right. She moved to her chest-high patio wall. Another bobbing light appeared. Beneath the silence of the desert, she imagined human voices, angry voices. She needed a better view. Setting Tom's photo aside, she placed her foot on a large rock and her hands on the wall between two flower pots. She sucked in her breath, counted to 3, and pushed herself up. In the process, she bumped a flower pot. It danced across the top of the wall, pirouetted over the edge, and crashed to the ground. The light disappeared. Maxine held her breath and waited. The light did not return. She lowered herself to the ground. She could call security, but what would she say? My husband died 10 years ago and I saw a light that isn't there. She hugged Tom's robe tighter and reached for his photo. Darkness obscured the details, but she knew the picture by heart. Tom's tanned face against a cloudless sky, thick hair tousled by the wind, blue eyes sparkling with mischief, his smile an invitation that warmed her still. For a moment, the patio swirled and all she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears. A second later, her breathing returned to normal and her vision cleared. Straightening her shoulders, Maxine crossed to an old-fashioned glider and sat down to wait for the sunrise. Without Tom, she might be a meaningless speck, inexorably drawn toward the dark abyss, but she would not be absorbed by that abyss, not yet. So for me, that opening scene, let me see, how do you see it? That opening scene and the final scene counterbalance each other. I think of it as defining the character arc. Hopefully Maxine changes a little bit. In some ways she stays the same, but in some ways she changes. And inside that frame, the story takes place, having what we might call the plot arc going on in there. I also wanted the opening pages to introduce both the setting and the characters literally and figuratively. So literally, we're at a retirement center, it's in a desert, it's in the mountains, and it's surrounded by a dark abyss. And the main character is not simply a widow of a certain age, but she's a woman of some courage, some determination, some impulsiveness, and maybe some loneliness. And finally, I wanted the opening pages to raise a question, sometimes called a story question. In this case, what's going on with Maxine and the lights? As the book unfolds, that question keeps getting refined and tightened and refocused. Now, when I say all that, these are all the things I meant for it to do. So if you don't think it did, I'm sorry. You could come up with a better thing. But that's what I was thinking I was doing when I was writing it. And then the last thing I want to say about the opening that I just read is totally irrelevant, but it's an interesting piece of trivia. A friend of mine told me that there's an Old English word for what's going on, what Maxine is doing. She's lying awake before dawn and worrying. And there's an Old English word, utsir, which means just exactly that, lying awake before dawn and worrying. And lately I've been doing a lot of Utsir myself, so I thought I'd share that with you. Every protagonist hero needs some kind of challenge, often represented by an antagonist. In this novel, the first challenge we run into is Maxine's nemesis, a woman named Carlotta. I will say that originally I had based Maxine on a wonderful woman named Ruth Messenger, whom some of you may know, but I wouldn't let her make any mistakes, and she had no faults, and nobody could do anything bad to her, which makes for a very dull novel. So I had to stop doing that and change her a little bit, so I stopped thinking of her as being Ruth. And as soon as I did, Carlotta reared her head. Maxine, I hope she actually has several challenges, some internal, some Carlotta, and a few other folks who come and throw obstacles in her path. So we left Maxine on the patio waiting for the sunrise. It does. She goes to the breakfast buffet and meets her bridge buddies, Rosemary Dukakis, who's tall and thin and loves to wear dark knits, and Rosemary's best friend, June Silverman, who's short and frosted blonde and round. Rosemary loves detail and order. June is endearingly scattered and overextended. They're kind of a Mutt and Jeff team, and they're good buddies. And then Maxine's best buddy of over 60 years is also there, a woman named Louise McMaster. Louise has COPD, so she's has a walker, a combination walker and oxygen cart that she calls, oh goodness gracious, that she called Seabiscuit. So Maxine's gone to breakfast, her buddies are there, and they're talking about the mysterious lights. When? Behind them a door banged, the hum of the room stopped. The silence was almost electric. Then the hum resumed at a higher pitch. Coffee cups clattered onto tabletops. Voices grew louder. Staccato footsteps tapped across the terrazzo floor. Maxine reflexively turned toward the disturbance. Carlotta Helmsley gloated her way towards them, brandishing an empty cigarette holder and fluttering her eyelids as if she were caught in a dust devil. She no longer smoked, but she still wielded her ebony and silver holder like a weapon. Maxine suppressed a shiver. Carlotta got on her knees, nerves like ice cream on a loose filling. Today she wore a flowing black pantsuit that Maxine might have worn to a cocktail party. Carlotta twitched her cigarette holder in an artificial wave, and her jacket opened to reveal a top made out of something that looked like gold confetti. Maxine corrected herself. She would never wear that outfit anywhere. Carlotta's eyes glittered like her outfit. "You don't mind if I move old paint, do you?" she said, and shoved Louise's oxygen cart into a corner where Louise couldn't possibly reach it. "These things are so dangerous, you know." Maxine set her cup down so hard the tea sloshed. She pushed herself out of her chair, retrieved Louise's cart, and returned it to its place at the head of the table. Hands on hips, she glared at Carlotta. Carlotta hissed through clenched teeth. "Actually, it's Seabiscuit," Louise said. Carlotta blinked and looked blank. Maxine snorted and sat. Carlotta waved her cigarette holder as if casting a spell. "Never mind all that. What do you think of the news? We need a new assistant director. Sandra's quit, and you won't believe the idiotic application Rupert created for the job." Surprised by the criticism from Carlotta, who normally oozed affection for Rupert and all of his ideas, no matter how inane, Maxine dropped her guard and asked the obvious question. "Do you have a copy of the application?" Carlotta puffed out her chest. "It's on the Foothills website. I found it this morning. But of course, you don't do computers, do you?" Maxine flinched. It was true. She didn't have a computer, didn't want a computer, and couldn't imagine anything that needed to be checked on a computer ever, much less before breakfast. Even the thought of using a computer made her palms sweat and her heart raced. Slowly, Carlotta lifted her cigarette holder in victory and inhaled as if sucking power out of the very air itself. Then even more slowly, she lowered her cigarette holder until it pointed directly at Maxine's heart. Don't worry, dear. I'll take care of everything. With that, she spun on her heel and glided away. Maxine rubbed her chest and stared at Carlotta's retreating back. The gauntlet had been tossed. The game was on. If only Maxine knew what game they were playing. So Carlotta enters. Thank you, Andrea. Carlotta enters, and the story question changes. We no longer worrying about the lights. In fact, in a part of that chapter that I didn't read to you, we find out the lights were Rupert and Sandra out on the patio arguing and with flashlights. What we're worrying about now is what is Carlotta up to, and what does it have to do with their assistant director? And Maxine really wants to know the answer to those questions. So as soon as Carlotta leaves, Maxine, although she's afraid of computers, drags Louise to the Foothills Library to use the dreaded computer. And I'm going to read just a few pages from that scene, in part because it redefines that story question one more time. It keeps getting refocused. And because it's actually the first scene I ever wrote. I mentioned that I knew that the only thing I ever wanted to do was write a novel. And I never actually did anything about it. I mean, yes, I went to school and I majored in English and I did a graduate degree in English and I taught English. I even taught, this is scary, I taught people how to write novels. But I actually hadn't a scribble or a doodle or anything down. So until about 12 years ago, when I signed up for Georgianne Eubank's wonderful writers workshop called Table Rock, which takes place every August, except for this year, of course. And even though I didn't have a doodle or a scribble, I signed up for a class called Revising Your Novel. I signed up because I knew the instructor. Her name was Lynn York, and I knew she was an outstanding teacher. And actually, she had been one of my students at Duke. And so now the circle was closing. I was going to be one of her students. And our first homework assignment was to interview one of our characters. So after class, I kind of sheepishly go up to her and I confess that I have not started a novel. I don't have any characters. And she gave me a teacherly stare and said, "You will." So I went home and I did. And in fact, that homework assignment gave me my setting, and it gave me Maxine and Louise, and it gave me the catalyst, the action really around which the rest of the novel spins. So I want to read you a little bit out of that. Remember, Carlotta has threatened Maxine, taunted her, and left. Maxine pointed at, and so Maxine drags Louise to the library. That's where they are now. Maxine pointed at the computer. "How do you make it work?" Louise's mouth fell open. "You're asking me? You don't get to be a black belt in bridge without being brilliant." "Life master, not black belt," Louise said. "And it only means that I've played bridge ever since Moses brought down the tablets and a deck of cards." "And that you have a good memory," Maxine said. "You were up here last week when Rosemary was teaching June how to find the Foothills house page, home page. So what do you remember?" Maxine dragged two ergonomic chairs away from the table. In their place, she arranged a matched set of intricately carved Chippendales. She perched on the front of one chair. Louise reluctantly followed suit on the other. "Well," Maxine said, "you push the round button on that big box on the floor and wait. When the screen wakes up, you shove the hand thingy around until the arrow is over the E with a satellite around it and click." "Click what?" "I don't know. That's just what Rosemary told June to do." Louise looked at the computer skeptically. "Should we wait for them to get back?" "I'm 82. I'm too old to wait for anything." Maxine spoke with more determination than she felt. She stretched a finger towards the large button and hoped that Louise couldn't see the tremor. The button felt cold and unyielding. She took a deep breath and pushed. Nothing happened. Let me see. Louise bent down to examine the box. I don't think that's the button. I think that's the logo. Try pushing the smaller button above it. Maxine glared at the box. It had tricked her already, and it wasn't even running. She mashed the smaller button. The computer clicked and whirred. She jerked her hands back. Lights flashed. Images raced across the screen, and music bleated out of the speakers. Then everything stopped. The screen turned a deep blue, and tiny pictures popped up everywhere. Maxine pumped her fist. Yes! Now what? Louise said. Now what? Maxine said, still basking in their success. How is this going to help us figure out what Carlotta is up to? Maxine's bubble burst. I'm not sure. I thought we might get an idea if we looked at the application Rupert put on the web. Louise rolled her eyes. What? It's a plan, sort of. It was more of a wing and a prayer, but it was all she had. Louise wisely said nothing. Maxine narrowed her eyes at Louise, but began typing. After several false starts and much extraneous clicking, they found Rupert's application. They bent to study the form. In unison, they sat up, looked at each other, then bent to study the form again. Louise finally broke the silence. Carlotta's right. The form is idiotic. Rupert only asked 4 questions, and 2 of those are name and address. Maxine's blood pressure mounted. It's not only idiotic, it's insulting. He doesn't ask anything meaningful. He doesn't even ask for references. Anybody could apply. Her words hung in the air. Anybody could apply. Anybody. So if you put a sentence like anybody could apply in a novel, you know what happens. Maxine immediately applies with Louise's help. She uses a pseudonym because they know that Rupert won't hire Maxine if he realizes it's Maxine because of age discrimination. So she tells Louise to use M. Octavia Olson, which creates a little bickering between the 2 of them because although they've been best friends for 60 years, Maxine had never admitted that she had a middle name, and it was Octavia. But notice the story question has changed again, I think. Now it's, is Maxine going to get the job? And that pretty much is what the story continues to focus on. And it continues, I hope the ante keeps getting raised. Maxine applies on a lark and as a protest against age discrimination. But as the story goes on and she sees who the competitors are, she begins to get very serious about wanting to get that job. She pursues it as if her life depends on it, because really in all the important ways it does. So now we have a setting and a hero, an antagonist, and an antagonist. Actually, we have several. We have Carlotta, and we have Rupert in his own ways, and we have age discrimination. And we have a sidekick or mentor in Louise McMaster. And sometimes that's 2 different figures, but Louise is one. And one of the things I just realized this the other day is that Louise, whatever she says is true. I didn't really realize that. Other people make mistakes, but Louise is pretty much always right. She's very quiet, she's very gentle, but whatever she says is true, which brings me to my second piece of trivia, which I will share with you on the off chance that it's true. A friend of mine was writing a Broadway play, and she claims that in a Broadway play, when you're singing, you cannot be lying. Whatever the person is singing has to be true. So even the villains, they are admitting what they're plotting, but they're not lying about it. So if you get bored during the rest of this, you can play through in your mind Broadway songs and see if that's true. But at any rate, so I have one sidekick mentor, and then as I was writing, a second one showed up. A woman who used to be called Celine Dion Jackson, but my publisher made me change the name. She said she refused to go to prison for me. So she's now Celine Diane Jackson. And she's one of my favorite characters. Unlike Louise, sometimes she's brilliant and sometimes she's just totally off base. So she's She's a sidekick, and sometimes she's a good mentor, and sometimes she's just wild as can be. She's larger than life. And when she sings, she has this beautiful, deep voice. And when she speaks, it's with attitude. And I can't do her justice. So whenever Celine is on, I ask you to imagine a beautiful, deep voice with attitude coming out. In terms of the story, after they've completed the application and sent it to Rupert, Maxine walks Louise back to Louise's apartment, then cuts across the shuffleboard courts and goes to her own condo. Inside her condo, Maxine picked up the newspaper, settled into her grandmother's bentwood rocker, and kicked off her shoes. Before she could open the paper, there was a loud bang. Her front door crashed open and a large figure burst in. Maxine yelped, her eyes blurred. The intruder brandished a club. Maxine froze. The intruder swayed. Maxine exhaled and her eyes refocused. A large chestnut-colored woman in a red and gold caftan leaned against the door frame, gasping. A feather duster dangled from her upraised hand. Goodness, the woman lowered her arm. She placed a hand on her ample chest. You nearly scared me to death. I frightened you? You need to be more careful. You could hurt someone that way. Maxine was speechless. The woman examined her, but it was probably an accident. With that, she tugged a cart into the condo and dragged it towards Maxine's bedroom. Maxine struggled out of the rocker and, despite her bare feet, followed the stranger. Excuse me. No need to apologize, the woman called over her shoulder. No harm done. You just go right on with your reading and I'll take care of everything. Maxine pushed past the intruder and folded her arms. Just exactly what do you take care of? The woman stared. Didn't you read your newsletter? I'm the new housekeeper. Oh. Maxine recollected her manners and stretched out her hand. I'm Maxine Olson. When the woman shook the proffered hand, half a dozen bracelets danced along her arm, exposing a small tattoo of a cherub. Before Maxine got a good look at it, the woman whirled away and attacked the bathroom. She Windexed almost as fast as she talked. I hope you don't mind if I work while we chat. I don't want to get behind my first day. I used to be the bouncer at Benny's Bar and Grill. I really liked the people there, but I needed my nights free on account of. The woman stopped and took a breath. You keep a really clean house, she said. Clean and neat, that tells a lot about a person. My name's Celine Diane Jackson. Like the famous singer? Almost. Some coincidence, isn't it? Some people think we look a lot alike. Celine twirled her full figure in a tight circle, as if showing off a new dress. And we're both singers, but I'm a lot sturdier. She's got a pretty face, though. I can see how people might confuse us. Maxine was fairly certain she would not confuse the pale, delicate features of the popular singer with the robust face before her. Celine lifted the vacuum cleaner off her cart and stomped on the power switch. You go on back to your paper. I'll be finished in no time. And I'll be so quiet, you won't even know I'm here. Maxine doubted that, but she returned to her rocker and pretended to read. So Celine is cleaning and singing some gospel songs softly, including Amazing Grace, which was one of in fact, the first piano piece Katie's daughter played in a recital. Katie is a prickly daughter. She's now a very successful businesswoman. She's a venture capitalist, but she's kind of distant. She calls Maxine mother instead of mom. She wants to be called Catherine instead of Katie. She's got a long list of rules that you have to live by if you want to keep her from running away. So Maxine is kind of drifting and thinking about Katie. Is there anything you need before I go? Maxine dropped her unread newspaper. Celine and her cleaning cart were lined up at the front door. You remind me of my daughter, Maxine said without thinking. Say what? Not that you look alike, Maxine added, as if that were an explanation. Celine narrowed her eyes. She's older than you, but you're both musicians. Celine's eyes lit up. Did she play or sing? Maxine stared into the past. She used to play the piano, mostly jazz. Used to play. Why'd she stop? I don't know. Celine stroked the small tattoo on her wrist. I can't imagine life without music. Maxine shook her head. Nor can I. Celine shifted. Tell you what. She stopped, as if uncertain what to say. Next time, I'll get behind the appliances for you. Maxine smiled and shook her head. That would be foolhardy. No one has ventured back there in years. I absolutely refuse to let you endanger yourself. For the first time since she'd arrived, Celine smiled. You're okay, Maxine. You too, Celine Diane Jackson. So one of the things that I like and respect about Maxine and Celine, they both make friends easily. And in fact, one of the things I consciously tried to do in this book, most of the characters were of an older generation, which is often portrayed satirically or as cranky, exclusive, negative. I wanted these folks to be inclusive and welcoming. And so there's some pretty over-the-top, outrageous folks that they just accept as they are. But in this instance, Maxine and Celine, they don't just naturally fall into friendship. It's like they sit off and kind of assess each other, and then something happens over the music, and it's Maxine's sadness about her daughter, and her daughter's not being involved in music anymore. And they have this kind of, I don't know, agreement pact, which again, it isn't really spelled out. It's just, you're okay, Maxine. You too, Celine Diane Jackson. Oh, Diane Jackson. Don't tell my publisher, Celine Diane Jackson. So I've been reading some excerpts, mainly from the beginning of the novel, to give you a sense of who the characters are. Paul Mijas, who's on this call, yeah, it's a call, read, I was telling some folks, an early draft, and he said, well, you can't have all flat characters, you know. They have to be rounder. Everybody has to have something positive and something negative. So I tried to do that, and I tried to give everybody a virtue and also a flaw or an opportunity to change, and some of them accept that opportunity to change and some don't. And with some, it was a lot easier to think up what their virtues were than with others. And I also tried to give them all a challenge that they were going to be struggling with in the novel, and some would succeed and some wouldn't. But the three main characters are Maxine, Louise, and Celine. So for the last passage I want to read, it's a little bit longer, but it's from near the end of the book. And I just thought you might like to see these three guys in action now that you've met them. In terms of the story, they're going to Benny's Bar and Grill, which is an establishment somewhere between a dive and a neighborhood bar. And it's in a really rough, tough section of town. Celine used to be the bouncer there until she quit in order to work at the Foothills for reasons that you'll find out in the sequel. The new bouncer, her replacement, is Fermé Labouche. Two other names that pop up is Katie, Maxine's daughter, and Mimi is a friend of theirs who is a fabulous torch song singer by night, and by day she works for the government in the Office of Tourism. So Benny's Bar and Grill. Celine had to circle the block twice before she found a parking spot. Maxine leveraged herself out of the back seat and helped Louise saddle up Seabiscuit, while Celine repositioned the Bel Air until its tires were precisely 6 inches from the curb. I don't want any scuff marks on my white walls, Celine said, and double-checked her tire alignment. Evidently satisfied, she swiveled through a complicated maneuver that made the sequins dance on her royal blue evening gown. Let's boogie. Look at that crowd at Benny's. You'd think it was Super Bowl Sunday. Do you think we'll be able to get in? Louise asked. 2 or 3 dozen burly men and women wearing black leather and chains were congregated in front of Benny's, smoking and blocking the entrance. Don't worry about a thing, Celine called over her shoulder. Just follow me. Her voice bounced off the buildings and echoed into the night. The gang stirred like some rough beast awakened by intruders. Celine stormed the crowd, armed only with her sequins and stilettos. "Wait here," Maxine said to Louise. "I'll retrieve her." She hurried after Celine, but it was already too late, and Louise didn't wait anyway. "Excuse me," Celine barged into the gang. The first 2 or 3 rows of hairy men and tattooed women gave way, but a 300-pound giant lounged against Benny's front door and refused to budge. He wore tight leather pants and a chrome-studded leather vest over his bare and exotically tattooed chest. His auburn hair was pulled back in a frizzy ponytail. "Excuse me, please." Celine's tone sounded insolent to Maxine. She thought of the rumble scene from West Side Story and wished she'd put pepper spray into her purse instead of lip gloss. "What have we here?" The giant's lip curled, revealing a gold tooth in the center of his mouth. The tooth reminded Maxine of something besides pirates. "Well, looks to me like a little entertainment just arrived," the giant leered. Aroused by the promise of entertainment, his gang closed ranks around them. Prickles of sweat rolled between Maxine's breasts. Crowds made her claustrophobic, especially crowds dressed in chains and leather. "That's because you're an ignorant, overgrown excuse of a boy." Celine tried to bluster her way past the giant, who laughed until tears came to his eyes. "You're in luck, because I like my women plucky." He wiped his eyes with the back of one tattooed hand. "Well, what's with the old biddies? Are they looking for a prince to kiss them and turn them back into toads?" The gang roared. Maxine felt faint and reached over to steady herself on Seabiscuit, but Louise was no longer beside her. Instead, she was trying to ram the giant with Seabiscuit. "Who are you calling old?" Louise swung her purse over her head as if it were a viable weapon. The giant bent down and grabbed Seabiscuit with one hand and the purse with the other. He was close enough that Maxine could see a tiny tattoo of an alligator over his left breast. It looked just like the Izod logo. "Is he?" Maxine's voice startled even her. "What?" The giant reared back, his nostrils flaring. "What'd you say?" "The tooth and the tattoo," Maxine said. "You're Izzy Goldman, aren't you?" "Say, huh?" Celine said. "Do you know him?" Louise sounded more annoyed than surprised. "Of course I do. He went to school with Katie." Maxine smiled at the memories. The giant narrowed his eyes and clenched his fists. Perhaps his memories weren't as fond as Maxine's. He'd been a large and rather clumsy child with an unruly mop of curly red hair, the kind of child who was chosen last for every team. He'd probably been teased mercilessly. Maxine's nurturing instincts kicked in. "He had the wittiest tattoo I've ever seen," she said. "Which one?" Louise asked. Maxine pointed to the giant's chest. "Izzy, show them the alligator." The giant seemed flustered and flattered to learn that his tattoo was witty. It's a crocodile," he said. "Hey, that's cute." Celine pulled the vest away to expose thick pectoral muscles. "It looks just like the little lizard on those fancy knit polo shirts." "Exactly," Maxine said. "I love this tattoo. It's so clever." She paused and looked at Izzy. Tattoos ran from his fingertips, up his arms, across his chest, and down to who knew where. But in all honesty, it was a better joke before you added all those dragons and skulls and things. "Poison ivy," Louise said. "Excuse me?" Maxine asked. Louise was uncharacteristically off point. Maxine hoped that she hadn't damaged her oxygen supply when she tried to ram Izzy. "The vine on his arm looks like poison ivy." "You're right, it does," Maxine said, relieved that Louise was as sharp as ever. "Do you mind?" The giant held his hands over his arms as if to protect his tattoo. "That's weed." "Yes, I know poison ivy's a weed," Louise said. "I just don't know why you'd want it on your arms." "No, not that kind of weed," he said. "You know, Mary Jane." "No, I don't believe we've met," Louise said. "Who is Mary Jane?" The giant looked helplessly to his motorcycle buddies, who collapsed in a fit of laughter. His face got that pinched, angry look that Katie's used to get just before a tantrum. He swung his attention back to Maxine with a ferocity that startled her. "Who are you, lady?" he said. "I'm Crusher with a K. Nobody calls me Izzy." "That's too bad," Maxine said calmly. She was no longer frightened. Izzy had been a clumsy kid, but not a mean one. He just needed validation. "I always thought Izzy was an important name, the kind of name a man's man would have." The giant straightened in surprise and narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Who are you?" "I'm Katie Olson's mom." Maxine offered her hand. The giant stared blankly. "You took music lessons with Katie. She played the piano." Maxine mimed playing the piano. Then she mimed someone playing the flute. "And you played the drums! I played the drums!" He shot her a wide-eyed look, then twitched his head towards his gang. Maxine caught on. "Oh, yes, of course." Being a flautist was probably not high on the list of qualifications for gang leader. "You were the badass drummer." The giant gave a barely perceptible nod. "So what brings you ladies out here this time of night?" He hooked his thumbs in his waistband and puffed out his chest. "We need to speak with one of the performers." "In Benny's?" "Yes," Celine said, her bluster back. "So you don't mind moving your big—" Before Celine could finish, Louise bumped her with Seabiscuit. "Ow, what'd you do that for?" "Sorry, the brake slipped." Louise repositioned Seabiscuit between Celine and the giant. Fortunately, the giant chose to ignore Celine. "Benny's can be a rough place for ladies," he said. "I'll go with you to make sure no one gets any ideas." They entered Benny's and Fermé Lebouche instantly floated up to them. "Well, darlings, what a surprise. You're getting to be regulars. And look what a delightful door prize you've brought me." She swished her entire torso towards the giant, who stared back nervously. "This is a friend of mine." Maxine gestured grandly. "He used to be called Izzy, but now he's called—" She wafted her hand in vague circles, trying to conjure the name out of the ether. Fermé shifted impatiently. Maxine gave up and rested her hand gently on Izzy's forearm. "I'm sorry, dear, but I've forgotten your new name." The giant seemed flustered. "I'm Crusher with a K." Fermé launched into her best Mae West imitation. "Glad to meet you, Crusher with a K. I'm Fermé with the most." Crusher turned fire engine red and stopped breathing. It was Celine's turn to be impatient. "We need to speak with Mimi. Can you let her know?" Fermé shot Celine an annoyed look and flounced away. Celine led them to their usual table. Although the women gladly sat, Crusher insisted on standing behind them with crossed arms. Like a member of the royal guard, he remained stone still, except for one tiny shrug that twitched open his vest and left his alligator tattoo clearly visible. "All right, let's hear you guys." Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Questions, discussion, problems, questions, suggestions. Bits of trivia I should have raised.
Judy, thanks so much for this reading. It's great being back in this world again. I was really struck by what you said about Louise, whatever she says is true, and that you were maybe realized that later. I'm just wondering if you had other surprises, if your characters gave you other surprises as you were writing. I know that reading is often surprising, but writing is also gives us surprises. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Oh, sure. One of the biggest surprises, I'm going to come back to this question. I'm often asked why the title. And one of the things I didn't realize until Paul told me is that there's a lot of game playing going on in this book. You know, not only bridge and shuffleboard and bingo, but the social games that are going on. So that was a surprise. I didn't realize that till you told me that. I didn't realize all the concentric circles, that imagery and those connections. And I didn't realize, well, once you had given me the tip that these guys were too flat, I didn't realize how much they all cared for, I did know how they cared for each other, but even the guys who I thought were going to be, you know, like Rupert, changed and became a much more interesting person. And some of the motivations behind Carlotta and Evie surprised me. Actually, the whole thing, you know, I didn't outline this. This is one of the reasons, not just because I didn't plug in my computer. That was not the only reason it took 12 years. I didn't outline this thing. I once outlined a mystery novel, the whole thing in great detail. And then it was like, well, why write it? Who cares? That was not interesting. So I would just sit down every morning and I would write, do what I call fast writes or free writes. And sometimes it would be a continuation of what I'd done the day before. Sometimes it was scenes. Sometimes it was, I actually had like a film script in there, all kinds of backstory and characters. And I just kept going. It was so much fun, you know, and I would just be surprised by what would show up. And I really believe that, well, you know, writers say the strangest things about their writing. Like the characters take on a life of their own, and when it's really going well, I'm just trying to channel what they're doing. You know, it's like I feel no control over it, just surprise. But at some point I realized, I think 10 years into it, that I had 700 pages, and 700 pages does not a novel make. So then fortunately I love rewriting and revising. So there was this throwing away all the stuff that didn't belong and rewriting the stuff that needed to and adding scenes. So the whole process was really a surprise to me. I was surprised by those moments when it did just seem to write itself. I was less surprised by those moments when I couldn't write an English sentence to save my life. You know, I taught for many years, so that editor, the critical side, she came up more often than I would have liked. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Maybe you answered my question just now, I'm not sure. But you talked earlier about the challenges that Maxine faced. And I'm wondering about the challenges that Judy faced.
Ooh.
So what would you say the biggest challenge was in writing a novel?
I would say for me, it was insecurity, my own insecurities. I used to joke, but it isn't really a joke, that the only two things I feared were success and failure. And they were both equally troublesome kinds of things to worry about. And it was only when I could, you know, when I stopped thinking about putting this out in the world, but I was just writing it for myself, that it got easier to do. And, you know, I said that all I ever wanted to do was write a novel. I wrote the novel and I actually did stick it in the closet for 2 years. And I finally realized, well, it isn't really done until it's published. And so fortunately, I have a friend, Jeanette Stokes, who is the publisher. She said, well, we can do that. We can publish that. And again, I gave no thought to that. It was like, okay. And so we printed it off, and then we had all these boxes of books sitting around. In fact, she made me agree to keep some of them in my house. That was very clever of her. She knew that I would be motivated to do readings if I had all these boxes of books in my house. But I think it was my own internal fears. You know, I've been very fortunate. I didn't have to raise 12 kids and work 6 jobs and all that kind of thing. I did foolishly think that teaching would give me my summers free to write novels. And of course, a lot of you are teachers and know that that isn't really true. You have to just force that time out. It isn't really there.
That is such a good answer to that question about failure and success. That was so good. Thank you. And I have to leave because I have another Zoom at 7:15, so I have to get ready. But I loved it. Judy, you did such a good job. You really did.
Oh, I owe it to what I learned from you at table.
This was so good. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Judy,
I got 2 questions.
did I hear you indicate that you have a second follow-up book coming?
I do have, I tucked some things into the first one in case I wanted to write a sequel. And it's not, During the COVID, I haven't been writing very much. I've been writing really bad haiku instead of writing a novel, but I'm beginning to feel extremely guilty about giving that answer. So maybe I'll get going on the novel. What I know that Maxine and Louise and Celine will be involved. And I think some of the characters who play more minor roles will take a larger role, like Crusher with a K is going to appear, I believe. And I envisioned a road trip.
Me and Katie gonna hook up?
No. No. Katie does need something in her life. Actually, Katie suggests that her mother use Crusher as an escort to one of the retirement center meetings. No, I had envisioned a road trip. I even had the itinerary. I knew just where I wanted them to go. And so Celine is driving, and the first thing she does is says, "I know a shortcut," and there you are off. And, you know, my itinerary is gone. I don't know. Paul asked what surprises me, and it's just, I try not to plan too much because it works a lot better. My character's a lot more creative and innovative than I am. So we'll see whether Celine ever comes back on the road with the rest of the crowd. I think Carlotta might actually play a positive role in the second book, but she doesn't mean to, of course.
An accidental hero.
Yes, yeah, one of those inadvertent acts of goodness.
I do those.
Oh, you're a sweetheart.
Hey, Judy. Leandra.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say I can't express how sort of shocked and pleased I was to walk by a store and see a flyer, you know, about your book. I think that's what I can't remember where I first saw it, but I was like, I know somebody named Judy Dearlove. And then I looked, that is you. I know that person. So anyway, I was very excited. I've bought it. I've started it. I haven't finished it, but congratulations. Pardon me?
The butler did it. Thank you very much.
But congratulations. So I have a question. Just a little bit of background. My father was a historian. He wrote books, but it was history, write it, you know, what happened, he wrote about it. Yeah. You know, I just retired from 40 years in academia, you know, do something, write about it. But in terms of fiction and novels, how did you know when you were ready to give it to the publisher? How did you know you were done?
Excellent question. What is the answer? There were things, by having people like Paul read it for me, he was so wonderful. He marked lots of stuff that needed to be fixed. And so then I tried to fix it, and I had other friends read it. And I began to get a better ear at, well, that doesn't work. I think I had it longer than I needed to have it, you know, a perfectionist, agonizing for weeks over whether I put, you know, whether it was cold or cool outside, whatever. I think for me, it's important to have a good friend who says, that's it. And this was true in the publishing part too, where you get the proofs back and you do the editing and all of that. Finally, my editor and publisher said, you are done. That's it. That's enough. Or I might still be, you know, filing away on it. Excellent question. There were some structural kinds of things that I was conscious of, like wanting a story arc and a character arc, and not wanting to have any of the loose ends, you know, have an important subplot going on that you just leave hanging. Hopefully I didn't do that. I don't know. That's a really good question. Maybe it was my brothers. I have another brother who isn't on this call, but maybe it was them saying, are you ever going to do anything with that book? It finally got me. Well, in fact, Dave, the brother who's not on this call, Actually, I decided it really had to be time to do something. Dave is very, I don't know, he's an architect. So he deals with numbers that have to be precise and things and objects and their finished points. And he's not, you know, in this wishy-washy world of words. And so one day I get a note from him saying, I have a friend who's published a book. Do you want me to ask him? I thought, okay, if it's bothering Dave, it's time to go.
It's a lot easier to read than your other book about Samuel Beckett.
Oh, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. In case anybody is looking for it, I do happen to have a few copies left of, you know, that. The funny thing is when I wrote that book, the academic book, I wrote it a gazillion years ago, and I was trying to make it accessible. That was back when English especially was writing very convoluted language. It was just English professors talking to English professors. And I think the idea was to make it so incomprehensible that nobody could ever disagree with you. So I thought I was writing a very accessible, down-to-earth book. And I got it out about 10 years ago. And I'm not quite sure I know what it says anymore either. But I wanted this one to be fast and fun and a lot easier.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you are extraordinarily funny. Like I was just laughing this entire time. How do you make sure that your humor comes across in your characters? Like I write a little bit, but I feel like nobody thinks the things I think are funny are funny. And so I'm like, how do you have your humor come across in the characters? Like how do you convey that your sense of humor to
Oh, that's
other
a great
people?
question. And it's a really, really hard one to answer. In part, I'm going to give you the same answer I gave before, which is it's helpful to have a lot of people read it and say, you know, I notice where they laugh. And some of the scenes that I thought were really, really, really funny are no longer in the book because I was the only one who thought they were funny at all. I did consciously, one of the things I consciously tried to do, you know, the books that are written to be funny, slapstick funny, I don't find funny. So I was trying to downplay it. I was trying to use maybe more wit language games than, well, okay, Crusher with a K is over the top. But I was trying to do that so that if you didn't think it was funny, it didn't matter. You could just keep reading the story and it wouldn't slap you in the face saying, oh, here, look how clever Judy is. She's made this funny. So I tried to make it soft pedal it in some ways. And it was helpful to have friends help me realize which ones had to be soft pedal. I think humor is the hardest thing to talk about and define. When I was working on my, in graduate school, I was going to write my dissertation on humor. And I spent, I don't know, a couple months on that. And I realized that this is a pit you will never get out of. You're never going to have an answer to this. So, you know, trying to define what it is and that kind of thing. I don't know, Paul, you're a writer. Do you have a better answer?
No, I think you answered it. I don't think I have anything to add.
This has been amazing. Do you have any last thoughts, Judy?
I have spent all of my thoughts, but I want to thank you all for coming. It's been so much fun to see you and talk with you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kathy, for hosting this.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope to see you at another program. Have a great one.